Okay, welcome to 29 May. Dis&Dat information, the autonomous collective.net. Going to look more at rentier capitalism and more specifically the work of Guy Standing. The reason why we're doing this, of course, is to figure out all those issues that have plagued us before. The problem of, as identified by Steve Keen, the issue of trying to work through labor theory of value and what is now a much more post-Keynesian approach to economics, or as Steve Keen has sort of described it, the transcending of the economics dismal meta-science, let's put it that way. In that same light, it is important, I think, to understand that rentierism of one kind or another does represent value at some moment, whether it's fully congealed or not as labor. Suggests another way in which we should be rethinking the 21st version of what counts as theories of value. And it is not problematic and not a kind of bad revisionism to think about that, because I think if you look in a more careful way, this idea of transformation is important. Is important when people urged us to revisit Hegel's logic. It was, Althusser, I think, points us in a direction, not the direction. And I think where we are now, and I think that history has proven it, that we need to think about a wider range of abilities to think about stuff. So, for example, in today's little thing, we're going to consider this idea that renterism, at one level, certainly in the 18th and 19th century sense, was treated as a parasitic, and there there are ranges of parasitism, needless to say. There's the parasitism that is simply feeding. There is the parasitism that, as I think I tried to suggest with thinking of new analytic categories, the idea that parasitism can create a kind of zombieism that is where you take control of the host. And so that's kind of what's going on. Now, it also explains why, for a variety of reasons, Guy Standing is interested in basic income, the basic universal basic income, because in that sense, it's a redistribution without getting into the terrible slog of property and congealment that that actually is an important issue to raise relative to a current economy, and is certainly within the context of post-Keynesianism. Uh, it's harmonious with, in fact, no different than rethinking, for example, the MMT arguments about money. So, current usage of the term rentier capitalism describes the gaining of rentier income from ownership of or control of assets that generate economic rents rather than from capital or labor used for production in a free competitive market. The term rentier state is mainly used not in its original meaning as an imperialistic state thriving on labor of other countries and colonies, see parasitism, but as a state which derives all or a substantial portion of its national revenues from the rent of indigenous resources to external clients. You could say that's what's going on for example, foreign property ownership of ground rents. With all due respect, not much study has been shown to note that various foreign countries own significant portions of U.S. property, which no one, on the one hand, they manage to gain a right to it. On the other hand, you want to think about what that means. And of course, you can see the same kind of parasitism in the awarding of favors as we've seen by the current administration. Guy Standing has claimed rentier capitalism has become predominant in capitalistic economies since the 1980s. Brett Christophers has asserted that rentier capitalism has been the foundation of the United Kingdom's economic policy from the 1970s onward, with a return of high inflation to the United Kingdom in 2022, as with the US. Political economist William Davies surveys recent British economic events in light of rentier capitalism. No different than the current issue of, ownership of condos, et cetera, in the US, while just simply, you need a place to live, et cetera. There's also other kinds of holdings, and you want to rethink that sort of idea. Now, I've included a video of Guy Standing himself, his smiling face there, but it also connects to other matters relative to the pandemic and the need for a universal basic income. So there's that as well. I've read this, a little bit of this before, and many much longer ago, but Technoscience Rent towards a theory of rentiership for technoscientific capitalism. And you can say that that's exactly what's going on. And in other matters, you can see that, it operates in a variety of fields. So the abstract for this brief article, and I'm not reading the whole article, I'm just giving you a flavor of it, is this idea of contemporary technoscientific capitalism. It's characterized by the reconfiguration of a range of things. Yes, I've been talking about things as well. Infrastructure, data, knowledge, and bodies as assets or capitalized property. And I think you can apply that to a variety of things. Needless to say, the attempt to cancel every international student's visa, for example, graduate students more specifically. But anyway, accumulation strategies have changed as a result of this assetization process. Rather than entrepreneurial strategies based on commodity production, technoscientific capitalism is increasingly underpinned by rentiership or the appropriation of value through ownership and control rights. For example, intellectual property, monopoly conditions, and regulatory or market devices and practices. That is, investment dispute courts, exclusivity agreements. While rentership is often presented as a negative phenomenon, i.e., for example, distorting markets, unearned income in both neoclassical and Marxist political economy literatures, and much in between. In this paper, I conceptualized, that is, this is Keen Birch's paper, rentership as a techno-economic practice and process framed by insights from science and technology studies, STS. STS is a broad range of, it's an umbrella for a variety of studies that also supports STEM activity and certainly history of science and technology, which is very important as well. So, rather than a problematic side effect of capitalism, the concept of rentiership enables us to understand how different forms of value extraction constitute and are constituted by different forms of technoscience. This allows STS, Science and Technology Studies, to contribute a distinctive analytic approach to ongoing debates in political economy about economic rents and rent seeking. And there are, of course, the key words. Tractors are an unusual starting point for research in science and technology studies, but one that reflects a broader set of emerging issues in technoscientific capitalism that STS scholars could pay more attention to. In an article on the Motherboard website, Kobler claims that farmers in the United States are purchasing black market software from Ukraine in order to hack their own tractors. Now, this is before the invasion. The reason for this is that tractor manufacturers have made it increasingly difficult, legally speaking, for farmers to do unauthorized repairs on their tractors. I stress there because Vines, Writing and Wired, claims that said tractor manufacturers are reconfiguring or destroying, in his terms, the very nature of ownership itself, and by extension, capitalism as we know it. Wines argues that tractor manufacturers are basically claiming that farmers don't own their tractors. This is that notion, Remember, a subscription is a kind of rent. Anymore, after farmers sign license agreements in which they are forbidden to tamper with, it's like an EULA warning, with their tractor software and electronics copyrighted by the manufacturers. This reconfiguration of it, and see Tesla, needless to say, this reconfiguration of ownership is an example of rentiership or the capture of economic rents. Generally, economic rents are the value that can be extracted from economic activity broadly conceived as a result of the ownership and control of a particular resource or asset, primarily because of that resource's inherent or constructed productivity, scarcity, or quality. As a concept, economic rent is usually associated with the ownership and control of land and has its origins in 18th and 19th century political economy, for example, Ricardo, Marx, etc. Some classical political economists sought to defend this ownership, like Thomas Malthus, although most criticized its negative effects on capital accumulation, for example, Ricardo. Since then, and especially during the 20th century, now the 21st century, economic rent theory has been applied more widely to natural resources, for example, oil, and financial resources and intangible resources such as knowledge. You can, extrapolate from that the arguments about futures and contracts, etc. Recently, economic rents and rent seeking have moved to the center of public debate. A growing chorus of academics, politicians, journalists, etc., analyzing contemporary capitalism have turned to these concepts as a way to understand the implications of contemporary capitalism's increasingly techno-scientific characteristics. From the pro-capitalist side, the journalist Robert Colville argues that the structure of capitalism is increasingly tending towards monopoly. And because of the network effects involved, this tendency is particularly pronounced in tech, unquote. From the anti-capitalist side, the academic Guy Standing argues plutocratic corporations are patent hoovers. That is, they vacuum up stuff, buying thousands of patents. It is a winner-takes-all market created by the regulatory apparatus, not market forces, unquote. Note, of course, that patent hoovering is no different than buying, options on film scripts of novelizations or whatever. So this applies in a variety of areas. Numerous people raise similar issues relevant to debates in STS, including the privatization and commercialization of basic research, network effects of information technology, business models of new technology, platform companies, ownership and use of personal data, threats to competition represented by corporate concentration and monopoly in tech sectors, and financial technology innovation. So that's just a brief thing from that Birch article, which goes on and discusses much more complicated things relative to science and tech. But I think hopefully you get the point. And there is, as a Guy Standing has noted, and the reason for going to some kind of universal basic income is the precariat under rentier capitalism. So we're in the midst, this Guy Standing, we are in the midst of a global transformation analogous to Karl Polanyi's great transformation described in his 1944 book, whereas Polanyi's transformation was about constructing national market systems. Today's is about the painful construction of a global market system. To use Polanyi's term, the disembedded phase has been dominated by an ideology of market liberalization, commodification, and privatization orchestrated by financial interests, as in his model. The similarities also extend to today's fundamental challenge, that is, how to construct a re-embedded phase with new systems of regulation, distribution, and social protection. Contrary to widespread claims, there has been no labor market deregulation, but rather state re-regulation. For instance, occupational self-regulation, largely ignored by mainstream labor economists, has been displaced by state regulation through complex systems of licensing, while labor market and social policy has shifted towards means testing, behavior testing, and workfare, directing the unemployed and others to do state-determined activities to obtain means-tested benefits. Any semblance of universalistic, rights-based social policy has been in retreat almost everywhere. Fostering globalization in the context of the ongoing technological revolution has been favorable for economic growth globally, but governments and international bodies have signally failed to counter adverse distributional outcomes within countries. Similarly, in advocating labor market flexibility, negligible attention has been given to the widespread economic insecurities that this has generated. Needless to say, the data is there. It's not been monkeyed around with in that instance, but the divergence of wages and income and et cetera, CEO compensation, et cetera. Meanwhile, the neoliberal phase of globalization has evolved into rentier capitalism, in which more and more income is going to those possessing physical, financial, or so-called intellectual property. Rental income has been boosted by increased firm concentration, see monopoly, in many economic sectors, epitomized by the rise of quote-unquote superstar firms and by government action, most notably the strengthening of intellectual property rights protection and the growth of the subsidy state. As governments have chosen to compete by throwing subsidies at large corporations and rich individuals. See the Trump administration. In so doing, they have regressively depleted public budgets. One term to describe this conventional fiscal policy is Pluto-populism, whereby tax cuts and subsidies are concentrated on so-called entrepreneurs, see Elon, and wealth creators, while state benefits and public services are cut, see all those unemployed federal workers, are cut for low-income groups ostensibly to reduce the budget deficits that result from the fiscal generosity to the rentiers. And yes, there's plenty of studies on this, and no one, particularly in the mainstream media, seems to read any of that stuff. Consequently, in most countries, the share of income going to capital has risen sharply, and the share going to labor has plunged. Within the share going to capital, the share going to rentiers has risen. Within the share going to labor, the share going to higher earners has risen. I just talked about wage divergence. If we wish to escape from the regressive economic paradigm, we must nurture a narrative and vocabulary that focuses on emerging socioeconomic groups. In that regard, a global class structure has been taking shape, in which the new mass class is the precariat. The precariat, as in precarious, is defined in three dimensions. First, those in it are being pressured to accept a life of unstable, insecure labor, with casualization now being extended by indirect labor relations in the concierge economy, crowd labor, and on-call contracts. People have multiple jobs, etc., and bearing, of course, the cost of attending to multiple jobs. Within the next decade, a majority of labor transactions may be of this type, with labor brokers and apps being ubiquitous. But although many commentators claim the precariat is defined simply by insecure labor, more importantly, they lack an occupational identity or narrative, must do a growing amount of work for labor that is neither recognized statistically nor remunerated. This is an informal economy, and typically must do jobs below their education level. The second dimension is a distinctive social income. The precariat relies mostly on money wages, which have been falling in real terms while becoming more volatile and unpredictable. The precariat is also losing non-wage enterprise benefits, paid leave, medical leave, occupational pensions, etc., which give labor-based security. Their loss means money incomes understate growing inequality. To compound the insecurity, the precariat has lost rights-based state benefits and has been hit by the drift towards means-tested behavior-tested benefits. The resulting poverty traps and what I've called precarity traps are powerful disincentives to taking low-wage jobs. The precariat often faces what are, in effect, marginal tax rates of over 80%. Note, of course, that the corporate tax rate was about that in the 1950s, which international bodies would deplore if applied to the salariate or elite. The third dimension of the precariat is crucial. Those in it are losing all forms of rights: civil, cultural, social, economic, and political rights. They are being reduced to being supplicants, obliged to please people to gain income or benefits, favors, and depending on bureaucrats to make discretionary judgments in their favor. This is humiliating and intensifies feelings of insecurity. While these dimensions of the precariat are evident, we still lack the statistics required to analyze them adequately. Just as the crisis of the Great Transformation led to a revolution in labor statistics, so we need one now. We should start by reconceptualizing work, escaping from the 20th century prejudice that only paid labor counts. Similarly, labor regulations must be reformed to correspond to the emerging forms of labor relations. Recruitment practices should be regulated, and the occupational regulation system must be overhauled to strengthen the right to practice. Since a large proportion of the precariat consists of migrants, a more mature debate is required on migration. It has been dominated by talk of walls and bans on benefits, and policy has evolved in regressive, class-based directions. There's also a need to respond to the growth of labor export regimes. The OECD should take up these issues. More importantly, the 20th century income distribution system has broken down, partially because it's the 21st century. Across the OECD, real wages have stagnated for 3 decades and are unlikely to rise much over the next decade for technological and globalization reasons. If so, the options are either to allow inequality to grow or to build a new distribution system that allocates income more equitably. The latter is not the same as devising a more redistributive fiscal policy. The new system should foster ecologically sustainable economic growth and give proper respect for free markets. This perspective should lead to reconsideration of such emancipatory mechanisms as basic income and sovereign wealth funds, which should be attractive to governments, business folk, unions, and the precariat in general. In short, the perspective should enable us to envisage the re-embedding phase of the global transformation. So that's an abbreviated short bit by Guy Standing, and I think that gives you a sense of what that might be, and that we do. I think people can generally accept that we exist within the context of a rentier state. Hazem al-Bawali suggested 4 characteristics of such a rentier state. In a rentier economy, rent situations predominate, and you can see that, service contracts, etc., for your stuff. The economy relies on a substantial external rent and therefore does not require a strong domestic productive labor. Number 3, only a small proportion of the working population is actually involved in the generation of the rent, whereas the majority is only involved in the distribution or utilization of it. This is how rentierism operates. Perhaps more importantly, the state's government is the principal recipient of the external rent. Now, a rentier state would be that, but as we've seen in various ways, there is a collusive element to certain types of rentier state. The usage of rentier states is based on the concept of rents. Rents, as defined by Adam Smith, are different from wages, which must be labored for. They're based on the ownership of land or resources. David Ricardo defined rents as a reward of the ownership of a resource, rights of property. When applied to natural resources, rents can be seen as the income derived from the gift of nature. Note, of course, that if the federal government owns the gift of nature and decides to retransfer it or to regift it to corporations, other things can happen. In a rentier state, the economy relies on external rents. Economies based on internal rents cannot be defined as rentier states, as they would require a productive domestic sector. In such an economy, rents would only be a part and they are, of the total income. While in rentier economies, rents take up a substantial part. Rentier states thus rely on external rents and not on the productivity of the domestic sector. This creates a rentier economy which influences multiple aspects of a state society. Note, of course, that in such definitions, there are always the case of quasi or pseudo um, states, rentier states. Origin, the first term use of the term rentier states was by economists in the early 20th century who used the term to describe European states that extended loans to non-European governments. Note, of course, this includes imperialism and colonialism. Lenin viewed rentier states, Rentnerstaat, or usurer states, as a form of imperialism. He stated that a limited amount of rentier states, or creditor states, would accumulate capital through the export of capital to underdeveloped and politically dependent debtor states, as in host-client, a host-client kind of relationship. According to Lenin, rentier states were a state of parasitic, decaying capitalism, and this circumstance cannot fail to influence all the socio-political conditions of the countries concerned, unquote. The modern meaning of rentier states was first defined by Hossein Mahdavi in his economic analysis of the imperial state of Iran. He defined rentier states as countries that receive on a regular basis substantial amounts of external rents. External rents are in turn defined as rentals paid by foreign individuals, concerns, or governments to individual concerns or governments of a given country. See all those Sahid drones that have gone from Iran to now being manufactured in Russia. According to Mahdavi, the payments for the passage of ships through the Suez Canal and the payments to countries in the Middle East to allow the passage of oil pipelines are forms of external rents. So this includes, of course, pipelines from Russia to the EU. Also, the revenues of the export of oil can be seen as external rents. Mahdavi denies the idea that oil royalties are a compensation for the extraction of resources. He shows that in the Middle East, governments and companies are able to make larger profits through monopolistic positions and price fixing. See the 1970s and now. He also shows that within the Middle East, there is no significant relation between oil export and production processes of domestic economies. So, needless to say, it's quite possible to consider a wide range of rentier capitalist behavior, and it includes all kinds of things, commodities, as they say. So I'll close with a slightly longer reading on issues of crony capitalism from an article by Paul Dragos Alijica, and Vlad Tarko on crony capitalism, rent-seeking, institutions, and ideologies. The notion of crony capitalism has become increasingly salient in recent years in policy analysis, in scholarly studies, in popular books on economics, as well as in mass media and in public and economic life. Both Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party have made crony capitalism their target. Yet, the notion of crony capitalism seems paradoxically ambiguous, less so these days. On the one hand, it seems that an intuitively clear concept conveying both a descriptive image and a normative assessment. On the other hand, its theoretical nature seems malleable up to the verge of losing any substantial content. The concept and its associated theoretical conjectures are also difficult to place in the context of various schools of thought. Ethical, political, economic, and social criteria and approaches combine in a confusing manner, bestowing the notion of crony capitalism with both its intuitive appeal and its analytically frustrating nature. The topic is thus surrounded by an entire array of questions. Is crony capitalism a technical term or merely a common language notion that tries to pass as a technical term? What are the elements of its conversion from a common language notion to a political economy one? Is this effort worthwhile? Do we really need a new label, or is it merely duplicating other terms, such as rent seeking? which are already well developed and fully functional in the scholarly literature. Yes, it does seem a little pejorative, doesn't it, cronies? What is its relationship to other key concepts used in the analysis and assessment of various business environments and economic systems? You know, all those people who traveled with Trump to Saudi Arabia, oh, I guess they could be cronies. You know, the head of Halliburton, guy from Boeing, etc. This paper is an attempt to respond to the challenge raised by such questions by offering a systematic and innovative approach. The literature so far has identified three distinct types of rent-seeking societies. That is, classical mercantilism in Western Europe in the 16th to the 18th century, which is kind of what goes on with Trump's little brain, real-life socialism, and state capitalism. Our thesis is that crony capitalism is yet another kind of rent-seeking society, distinct of those three, and that its key distinguishing feature is that the prevailing rent-seeking structure is legitimized by means of a populist ideology. Oh no, the other types of rent-seeking societies were legitimized by significantly different ideologies. Mercantilism by religion, by military concerns, real-life socialism by utopian socialism, and state capitalism by nationalism. And you can see that there's a little flavor of all of that in the current situation, and sort of disentangling it is really important. Previous analyses of crony capitalism have not gone very far beyond the mere application of the rent-seeking perspective to countries labeled quote-unquote crony capitalist. Going beyond the common background of rent-seeking and populism, our analysis also explores the distinct manifestations of crony capitalism in various countries, depending on their level of development and the presence or absence of rule of law. Another micro-level concept related to rent-seeking, i.e., the idea of crony relations and the institutional focus on the importance of property rights, hold the key for understanding these differences. We point out that in developed countries with rule of law, such as the United States, crony relations play the role of restricting the entry and competition for gaining politically granted rents, thus preventing rent dissipation. Hence, crony capitalism is not mere rent-seeking. It is a meta-rent-seeking mechanism for securing the rents at consistently high levels. By contrast, in developing countries such as South American states, crony relations are a mechanism for securing property rights in the absence of rule of law. United Fruit, for example. By creating an overlap between those who have the power to confiscate property and the owners of large firms who have property that should be confiscated. Due to such a crony and a personal overlap, some property rights in those countries remain relatively safe. This type of analysis allows us to explain the interesting observation that in developed countries, corruption is a complement to the official economy, El Salvador, rather than a substitute, while in developing countries, the situation is reversed. On the analytical level, the emerging result is a framework with three facets. A, microeconomic, that is dealing with the basic economics of rent-seeking and crony relations. B, institutional and social, that is dealing with the specific structures and configurations of institutions, policies, and processes in their context. And C, ideological, dealing with the ideas, rhetoric, beliefs, doctrines, and other forms of legitimization and justification of the specific policies and institutions. This framework helps us chart the phenomenon of interest in a pioneering way and to articulate some tentative answers to the questions surrounding the nature and structure of crony capitalism. The analytical avenues thus opened are important not only for the efforts to disentangle the normative ethical angle from the economic institutional one, but also for the further development of the notion of rent-seeking society as an instrument for the analysis of the business-government relationships. Number two, cronyism in the literature, a tentative taxonomy. An overview of the relevant literature shows that the concept of crony capitalism or cronyism is closely connected to the idea of rent-seeking and corruption in both the popular and the scholarly discourse. In other words, the concept of crony capitalism incorporates both an ethical judgment and a purely positive description of a feature or form of an economic process. For instance, some authors use the expression simply as a morally loaded synonym for rent seeking, while others use it as a quasi technical label meant to describe a political system rife with corruption. We are especially interested in the use of the term as an economic system descriptor, either directly in connection to rent seeking or indirectly as an associated variable. Once alerted to the need to separate the normative from the descriptive use of the term, a closer look at the relevant literature reveals that the term crony is used in distinctive manners, all of which have some relevance to our effort in clarification and analysis. So, crony exchanges are based on trust, loyalty, family, and long-standing social network. The most significant and consequential form of cronyism usually involves relationships among members of the upper echelons of society or between large firms and the political class. Bribery, although not absent at high political levels, is used as a term to characterize especially the relationships between the lower strata of society or smaller firms and the lower members of the administrative apparatus. Number two, a crony change of laws at the top as a result of lobbying and crony relations affects the entire industry, whereas bribery tends to be firm specific and with much smaller spillover effects on reducing competition. Moreover, a bribe provides only a temporary fix for a firm, while a change in laws can have a much longer term effect. Given that bribes are illegal, they are also not enforceable in court. While a large firm can use a law designed to its advantage by suing competitors. Number three, a politician deciding on whether to push forward with a legislative change that favors a particular firm faces a different kind of incentive structure from a low-level bureaucrat who decides whether or not to accept a bribe. Thus, the political dynamics of corruption is very different in the two cases. This example also illustrates the conceptual transition from an approach to cronyism as an interpersonal and cultural social phenomenon, transactions, to cronyism as a structural and systemic feature, that is, crony capitalism. Now, in trying to pinpoint the phenomenon of crony capitalism, we've emphasized that despite the central role played by the concept of rent seeking, we need to consider two additional dimensions. First, at the structural level, rent seeking activities take many forms, are embedded in, and are embedding a large range of institutional arrangements and processes. We have explored the connection between corruption and the shadow economy in high income and developing countries and the use of cronyism in developing countries as a second best solution to the problem of property rights. Second, from an ideological point of view, we need to pay attention to the legitimating discourse used to justify the regulation in the eyes of the general public, thus engendering a certain level of voluntary compliance and public support. Pardon all those people, all those hardened criminals. Our papers identify the specific ideological dimension of crony capitalism, its opportunistic but very effective use of popular rhetoric. So we have argued that the notion of crony capitalism helps us identify an important new layer. Remember, I've been looking at layers to the existing theory of rent-seeking society. Besides the legitimation of the interventionist system in terms of the quote-unquote thin ideology of populism, we can point to distinct functions of cronyism in developed versus developing countries. In developed countries, cronyism provides a mechanism for restricting the competition on the rent-seeking market, thus increasing the rents. In developing countries, crony relations provide a second-best solution to the problem of insecure property rights due to a lack of rule of law and of limited government. Based on these insights, we conclude that crony capitalism is not just a redundant term, a mere substitute for rent-seeking, or just a vague, ethically charged label. It designates a novel or unique, sui generis phenomenon, a polymorphic, elusive, but powerful reality. Its features suggest that it has a real potential for expansion, consolidation, and relevance in the contemporary world. As such, it may be emerging as one of the most important challenges to democratic market capitalism, be it in the neoliberal or the social democratic form. Hence, the endeavor to better understand its nature, structure, functioning, and dynamics, as well as the variety of its ideological disguises, becomes an important and challenging task. So I mean, I can yammer quite at length about this, but I think I've given you the overall idea that um, there are things that are much more pervasive that are easily described as rentier capitalism, but that there's a lot more in the details that have to do with institutional arrangements, a class, as in class struggle, and a variety of other matters. We have to redefine property. We have to redefine what counts as rent and rent seeking, and often identify it, even though it may be disguised as something else. And the disguise is not so, opaque, let's put it that way. And note, of course, that if it goes back to Lenin, it's been around for a while. The concept of rentier capitalism is not unusual. It operates in interesting ways, causes all kinds of problems. For example, if you were going to estimate the rise of Nazism in Germany in the interwar period, it's still a problem to describe various firms, of which we currently buy products as crony capitalists, so that the hagiographic or the biographic literature of capitalism, of business history, for example, might describe some rather famous families as part of the cronyism. And of course, that's problematic for a variety of commodity related reasons, but and others, of course, in terms of reputation and wealth. But I think it's those fractures still remain. And of course, we've seen a sort of an abuse of that set of concepts in the current in the current economy. So, needless to say, I think those are all the silliness that I want to engage in for today. There are no questions. Let me uh, end, stop share, end the live stream. Oh my. Uh, and return you to our regularly scheduled program. This has been Dis and Dat, 29th of May, the autonomous collective.net. Um, I do this every weekday at 4 o'clock for the most part, and do weekly Marxism at 2 o'clock on Saturdays and Sundays. Thank you very